Well, welcome everybody. I'm Deborah Brown, President and CEO of Governance Solutions, and I'm joined today by my partner, David Brown. He's my partner in life and business. Welcome, David.
Hi, everybody. Great to see you all.
Okay, well, as Raphael said, over the next half hour, we're going to focus on the topic that we've called the not 10, five biggest mistakes board members make and how to avoid them. And nobody likes making mistakes. I know I don't, especially mistakes that are avoidable. And so here are the five biggest mistakes board members make and how we can avoid them. And I'm going to just jump in with mistake number one, and that is joining a board without knowing what's expected of you. And I'm going to start with a story. So as many of you know, we do a lot of board evaluation. In other words, we assess boards on their effectiveness. And sometimes as part of that process, we conduct interviews that help us get a kind of a good sense of what's going on in the boardroom. And so recently we did one of these evaluations for a large nonprofit organization here in Canada. And we were interviewing the chair of one of the board committees. And so when asked what's not working all that well in the governance of the organization, she told us, well, the committees, they're not functioning very well at all. And so we said, okay, and we probed a little bit. And can you tell us more? What exactly isn't working? And she said, well, my committee never meets. We don't know what we're supposed to be doing, and it's really frustrating. And so now this, you'll recall, was the chair of the committee. And so she had no idea what was expected of a board member. She had no idea what was expected of her as a committee chair. The committee wasn't meeting because she hadn't called a meeting. And she didn't know what she was supposed to be doing, but didn't even bother to ask. And, you know, I can't make this stuff up. It actually happens. So, David, what can you do to avoid getting caught in this trap of not knowing what's expected of you when you join a board?
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. So if you're considering joining a board, begin by doing your homework. Now, I can't tell you how many people I've met who agreed to serve on a board without really having the slightest idea what they just agreed to. And there's just as many organizations out there who recruit potential board members without providing clarity on those expectations. And both the organization and the board member then are surprised when there's not a fit between the person and the position. So if you're on the recruitment side of this, the important value exchange, you want to be providing what we call pre-orientation, pre-onboarding. Let people know before they've even agreed to run for or accept an appointment to your board, what does the organization do? What's our strategy? Why do we exist? What's our vision? What's expected of board members? You know, just as you want to assess if the person's a good fit for the organization, the person being asked to consider your board position should also want to assess the fit. They want to know if they can add strategic value to your plans and priorities. You know, what are the time commitments? What are the expectations? If you're being recruited, you'll want to know what the current challenges of the organization are. Are you walking into big problems? Or is the organization healthy in terms of strategy and culture? See what you can learn about the culture and how you might fit with it. What is the time commitment, the real time commitment? How often does the board meet? Are there board committees, and is every board member expected to serve on one? When do they meet? For how long? What about travel? Where does the board meet? Are you up for international travel? For example, board that Deborah sits on has met in Albania, South Africa, Malaysia, Indonesia, and next year, South Korea. Are you up for that kind of international travel? What about financial expectations? Depending on sector, this can differ dramatically. In the private sector, you can expect that they'll compensate you. But in the not-for-profit sector, there may well be an expectation that board members donate to the charity. You'll want to know what those expectations are.
Yeah, there are so many expectations that we often come across, and they're they're often just unspoken. Nobody thinks to ask and nobody thinks to tell board members when they're thinking about joining your board. So that's wise advice, David. Okay, here's mistake number 2. And this next mistake board members make is that they try to do the job of the CEO, sometimes called executive director, depending on the sector you're in, but they try to do the job of the CEO and their staff. Now, this mistake, it flows directly out of that first mistake, not knowing expectations. So most people who serve on boards are very used to managing in their day job, managing organizations or managing departments. They're usually very hands-on in the business in their day job. They handle staffing, they create products and services, they deliver those products and services. But when you're on a board, you're not there to do those things. You're not there to operate the business. You're there to oversee it and to gain reasonable assurance that the organization is on track. And so transitioning from being a manager or executive to serving on a board can be really hard for some people. And so therefore they try to do someone else's job because it's what they're comfortable with. It's a little bit like this transition from being a parent to a grandparent. I have 6 grandchildren, so I know a little bit about this. My kids would not appreciate it if I drove over to their house every day to make sure they were doing things the way I would do them. Nor do they want my advice on how the kids should dress or what they should eat or where they should go or what sports they should be in. They don't want my advice on that. And now my kids do appreciate it when I talk through a particular challenge they may be having. Sometimes they'll say, can you put your mom hat on? And then I know they're looking for advice. They're asking for my advice. And then on a very rare occasion, when I've spotted something that maybe they haven't noticed, and I think that might have happened once or twice in about the 18 years I've been a grandmother, then they've really appreciated that. But it's just not helpful to anyone if board members try to take over management's job, just like it's not helpful to my children to try for me to take over their job. Management resents it, it makes them feel disrespected, and it starts a vicious cycle of low trust and deteriorating relationships. So David, maybe you have a story to help illustrate this. And also, while you've got the floor, what can people do to avoid making this mistake?
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things we've got, as you say, is a lot of experiences with real boards after working full-time 30 years in this business. How about example of the number of board committees? What do you think, just off the top of your head, is the maximum number of board committees we've seen at an organization? We had one client a few years ago that had 55 committees of the board, but that's not even the record. We ran into one even more recently that had 70 board committees, 70, you heard that correctly, 70. And essentially the culture of the board was that every time they saw a problem, no matter who identified the problem, and usually it was a board member, then they felt that the way you solve that problem is you strike a committee of the board and you populate it largely with board members and you have it report back to the board. And they were great at striking them and really poor at ending them. And some of these committees would keep meeting for years, 6 years, 7 years, 9 years, long after anybody was even on the board remembered why they were meeting in the first place or what the problem is that they were originally struck to solve. And they're all hands-on, tactical, operational. So you can imagine, how does that feel if you're on the other side of the boardroom table? If you're the CEO and senior staff of the organization, you feel completely unempowered. You feel frustrated. You're basically providing an administrative, a low-level administrative function for the board. And there's no time or energy for the organization's problems to be resolved by the people that are the professionals in that, the senior staff and management, or to fulfill the purpose of the organization. Can you imagine how much time it takes to just deal with the administration of 55 or 70 committees of the board? So that led to high turnover at senior levels, difficult to attract and retain really good people. The organization had trouble recruiting good people and had a bad reputation in the marketplace as an employer. So what can you do about it? If you're somebody joining a board, you can avoid the mistake of trying to do the job of the CEO and staff by knowing what your role is and sticking to your lane. The board's primary job under the law is governance, supervising the business and affairs, setting the strategic direction and gaining confidence you're headed in that direction. Management's job is operations. We have a saying that we actually borrowed from Ernst & Young. A great director doesn't substitute their judgment for management's. A great director makes sure management is exercising sound judgment. A great director doesn't substitute their judgment for management. A great director makes sure that management is exercising sound judgment. So if you're already on a board, make sure everybody's got clarity on where the difference is, where is the line between those two things.
Thanks, David. I see the comment from Mark. I didn't know there were 55 or 70 discrete topics a board could create committees for. I'll tell you, if I had a dime for every time I heard a board member say, we should strike a committee for that, I would be mega rich, I tell you. Yeah, so clearly very much on the operations side in those two organizations David told us about. All right, so thanks for that, David. Now, here's mistake number 3. Mistake number 3 is they ask the wrong questions. There's some research that shows the average person asks about 100 questions every day. I probably ask that and more. I don't know. David, my partner in life and business, is around me all day, every day. So he can probably tell you how many questions I ask him in a day. But now I would say most of the questions that we ask in a day, they just kind of slip off your tongue. We don't really think too deeply about them. They just kind of come out. We spit them out, and we're not all that thoughtful in most questions we ask in a day. And this is actually a recipe for disaster in the boardroom. If we don't ask thoughtful questions in the boardroom and ask them in the right way, then they become thoughtless questions, and our thoughtless questions can lead to significant negative outcomes. So David, how do we avoid this one?
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. You know, we often teach that the #1 skill of a great board member is asking that great question. And the word here is skill. This is something you can learn. That's the good news about this. You can avoid asking wrong questions by practicing, identifying a great question from a not so good question. One of the tools is differentiating between open-ended and closed questions. You know, open questions probe for understanding. They're questions you're going to ask at the front part of agenda items when you're trying to probe for assumptions and alternatives and divergent thinking and different perspectives. They allow people to build on your thoughts and the thoughts of others. Open questions can't be answered with a yes or a no, while a closed question can. The purpose of a closed question is just as it sounds. It's to bring closure. Did you, will you, can you, are you, rather than open-ended, which would begin with how might we, why did we, what did you consider? What are the pros and cons? What are the implications and anticipated results? Why do you think that? What more can you tell me? These are brilliant questions that asked at the appropriate time in agenda items just release wisdom and knowledge into a room. So think about it this way. Instead of asking, are you planning to implement the new software solution? Instead, ask, what are your plans for implementing a new software solution? At times when you're seeking confirmation or validation, a closed question is okay. Can you confirm all statutory remittances have been paid? But more often, open-ended questions that are strategic are your better tool to probe and learn more, to better inform your final decision. And the more you ask open-ended questions in the boardroom, the more value you will add, and the better you hone that skill. Now, questions, whether they're open or closed, are generally preferable to comments or suggestions. Whoever the presenter is, asking them a question is the best way to better understand their assumptions, alternatives, assessment, recommendation. But if you share a comment or suggestion, it just tells them what you're thinking, and it kind of knocks them off the track that they're on. But if you frame it through the lens of a question, it becomes more powerful. So for example, instead of saying, I wouldn't have done that, I would have done this. Instead, ask, why did you choose to do that instead of this? And then strategic questions are preferable to operational ones. By strategic, we mean forward-looking and high level, substantive. By operational, we mean tactical, detailed, micro, who's doing what. Even if we're interested in an aspect of operations, it's more powerful and consistent with the governance role of a board if we frame it through the lens of strategy. So for example, instead of saying, I notice this position is still vacant, ask, what challenges are you facing in filling senior positions? When do you think they'll be in place? So you can avoid asking the wrong questions if you plan your questions. And that means studying your board pre-reading packages. You know, it's surprising. I guess it shouldn't be after this many years, but how many board members show up in meetings essentially unprepared? They haven't read through their package. They haven't done their fact finding before the meeting. They haven't prepared some open-ended strategic questions for key agenda items at the meeting.
Yeah, I know I tend to be someone who very easily will ask a closed question. And so if I'm in a board meeting, I have to really discipline myself to ask open-ended questions. I really have to practice it. And I absolutely plan my questions ahead of a board meeting. I read my pre-reading package and I plan my open-ended questions so that I don't fall into what would be very easy for me, and that's asking a closed question. So that's great advice, David. In our Amazon best-selling book, Governing in Scary Times, you will actually find a repository of 170 strategic questions that you can consider answering. And so I'm going to just kind of do a little aside here and say maybe we should give away a copy of that book right now. How's that sound, David?
Why not? I'd be surprised if you didn't.
All right. So if you're ready at your keyboard, the first person to type the correct answer in the chat wins a copy of Governing in Scary Times.
Glenn's got his up.
Yeah, oh, look at that. Glenn's got his. Good, good. Okay, so a few minutes ago, I told you 2 ways that David and I partner. What are those 2 ways? There we go. Oh, it's going so fast. I missed that. Hafa, can you tell me who won that book?
Yes, I wish I could. Let me check here. A lot of questions.
It's just going. Life and business was the correct answer.
Kelly S was first.
Yes,
Okay.
Kelly X.
Kelly, so Hafa is gonna connect with you there on the chat and get your coordinates so that we can send you off an autographed copy of that book. All right.
Wow, that's a lot of people got it right.
Yeah. Well, I said it twice because I knew I would
Mm,
ask that question.
clever.
All right. Mistake number 4, thinking you can be a great board member without actually learning how to be one. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I've started a new job, I fully expected that I would need and I would get training on how to do that job. It's kind of a given when you hire a new employee, we train them on how to do their job. And so why then, when we get asked to serve on a board, would we expect anything less? And yet so many people think they can just step into a board seat without first learning how to be a board member. And organizations invite people to serve on their boards without providing the needed orientation or training that their directors need. You know, this is the most senior group of leaders in the organization. So of all people in the organization, they should be trained at the very least in their roles, responsibilities, their fiduciary duties. Every board member should know what governance is, why it matters, and how to govern. What's the difference between the role of the board and the role of the executive team? So David, what are your thoughts on this issue? I know you've got some.
Yeah, well, of course, I'm a big fan of learning. That's we're lifelong learners and teachers, both of us. And so, but there's different ways to get governance education and training. There's some that are better than others. For example, you don't want to over rely on Google governance, on just using search engines and sort of random sources for governance education, especially nowadays. And I'll tell you why. When we started consulting in corporate governance 30 years ago this summer, we were one of only two full-time governance consultants in the country. In fact, didn't even call it corporate governance back then. It was called directorship practices. And since then, governance has become a mature discipline with comprehensive systems and education. And there's hundreds and hundreds of governance consultants, from people who are amazing to people who serve maybe on a small not-for-profit board and think, I like this governance stuff. I've got some affinity to it. I think I'll hang out my shingle and call myself a governance consultant. So it's a little like the Wild West. Governance consulting and training isn't regulated. So you want to be careful.
I think that's one of the reasons we offer free governance education every other Tuesday. So we make it so getting quality governance education doesn't need to be an expensive endeavor. We also offer short, inexpensive programs on topics like how to read and understand financial statements. We've done some on, I don't know, boardroom culture and succession and how to be a great chair and ESG, a number of other topics. We've got one coming up this fall on understanding financial statements. So, and of course, you can always go to that next level and earn your governance designation through the Professional Director Certification Program. So there's all kinds of ways that you can get the education that you need. I remember back in the late 1990s, we organized a series of national governance conferences for the Conference Board of Canada. Did that for quite a few years. And so every year for several years in a row, I planted a question in the audience for the closing discussion panel. There was always this closing panel of, the leading governance minds in the country at the time. And so the question I planted was, should board members be expected to get governance education? And the first year it was asked, the panel was almost, you could almost hear them go, like they were almost appalled at the idea that how dare someone think that they need to be educated to sit on a board. If you have a board seat, you have, worked hard and you've been maybe a CEO or an executive, and you've earned the right through your management experience to enter the position of being a board member without training or education. And so for years, the answer really remained the same. Now, eventually, there were enough corporate failures that pointed directly into the boardroom at boards not fulfilling their governance role that the time finally came when there was we created a governance education and certification program. So today, getting a governance designation, it's almost a must for certainly for corporate boards, for boards in the public sector, some of the large not-for-profits, and even some of the smaller ones, some in the municipal sector. And so now we're at the point where the TSX contacts us to confirm the designation of our graduates. And so we've come, as they say, we've come a long way, baby. And if you want to be on a board, you'll need to build your competence so that you know what you're doing. Okay. So far we've talked about joining a board without knowing what's expected of you, trying to do the job of the CEO and their staff, asking the wrong questions, and I would say the wrong questions in the wrong way, thinking you can be a great board member without learning how to be one. And here's mistake number 5, agreeing to be a board member for all of the wrong reasons. Little story about me. When I was young, I drove my parents to distraction by constantly asking the why question. For me, knowing the answer to the why question, it's a prerequisite in my decision-making process. I just need to know why. That's who I am. I'm sure most of you are the same way. I need to know why in order to make decisions. So before you ever say yes to a board position, you want to make sure you're crystal clear on why you're saying yes. Now, David, I'm going to ask this to you in reverse. When should prospective board members say no to a board position?
Yeah, that's a good way of asking the question. So here's some examples of when you might want to say no. If on reflection, the answer to the why question is, this strokes my ego. People will think I am somebody. If I say I'm on the board of this organization, it would really flesh out my resume or my CV. Say no. What about if your intuition is telling you you don't really want to be a board member of the organization, but you're under a lot of pressure to say yes, or there's some kind of reason, whatever the reason is, that you feel you can't say no. Don't go into something like that, lukewarm or in doubt. What if you're a shareholder or a member of the organization and your motivation is to advocate for a specific position or strategy, a change in the organization that's important to you, that would benefit you or your ownership group, your special interest group? That's not a good recipe. There's other routes for you to do that rather than becoming a fiduciary, a board member. And what about, I have an interest in this organization. I don't like the way they're running things. I think I know how to run the organization better than the current board and CEO are doing. That would be a good reason to say no. Again, there's different routes and roles that you can play than being a board member and being a fiduciary. So if any of these examples describe you looking at a board position, just have the courage to say no, the courage and character to say no, and leave those board member positions for people that the organization deserves. Let me illustrate with a story at this point. We were working with a board recently, helping them with their board renewal process. And this particular board is one where the board members are elected by a membership. But they have a nominating committee that uses a robust process to pre-qualify candidates. So they understand that the downside to membership elections is it's often a popularity contest rather than competency based. So they've inserted a nominating committee that reviews and pre-qualifies candidates. And if your name has a star next to it on the ballot, it means the nominating committee has qualified you. And if your name doesn't have a star, it means you're not qualified for the position, but you've chosen to run in the election anyway because of your democratic rights in the act and the bylaws. Now, typically, if you don't get a star, people don't run. But one of the individuals in this case who applied, they did not qualify, and they were advised if you wanted to run, you still can, but you won't have a star next to your name because the nominating committee hasn't qualified you. And to be clear, the electorate's going to know that you didn't qualify. Well, in the end, they chose to run anyway. And here's what they said to us. I knew I was underqualified when I applied, but I wanted to throw my hat in the ring so I'd be better known with the membership. They have political aspirations and they want to leverage the election and the organization to build their reputation so that they can advance themselves politically in that profession or in that membership group. That is not a good reason to seek a board seat.
No, not a good reason. And you worry in a case like this, maybe they're actually very good and very politically astute and they get elected. And so how does that serve the board if they do get elected? Because now you have someone who is unqualified, who's there for all the wrong reasons, and it just weakens the whole of the board. So these are not good reasons. Now, this is when you should say yes. If you're going to join a board, you want to do it because you're aligned, I use the word calling, you're aligned with the purpose of the organization. You agree with it, you feel called to it, you want to go and add value to that organization. You're competent, you know what you're getting into, you understand your role, you're well positioned to add your unique value at a very strategic level. And so if that describes you and your motivation in relation to the open position, then by all means say yes. But you really do want to take a look at that why question. Why am I doing it? And be honest. You know, there's nothing like telling yourself the truth. Be honest with yourself about why you're joining the board. Okay, so those are the 5 biggest mistakes